What happened to the children of famous conquerors? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when empires were built on the ambition of a single person, and occasionally ruined by the mediocre offspring that followed. So, dim the lights, settle in, maybe wrap yourself in a soft blanket, and let's explore the peculiar, fragile, and often sadly comedic lives of the children of history's most famous conquerors. It's always curious, isn't it, how someone can carve a swath across continents, change the course of history, and yet, somehow, their children rarely manage to live up to the legend. Perhaps it's genetic, perhaps it's circumstance, or perhaps it's simply because growing up as the child of a world-shaking genius is exhausting in ways we can't imagine. Let's start gently with Alexander the Great, a man whose reputation makes him seem untouchably brilliant. He conquered nearly everything in his path by the age of 32, which is impressive, because by 32, most of us are still figuring out how to balance our bank accounts. Naturally, this left him with a small problem: what happens when you leave behind a child who is expected to inherit the world? Alexander had a son, Alexander IV, with his wife Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria. The boy was born posthumously, after Alexander's untimely death in 323 BCE. And the poor child's life was, unsurprisingly, complicated. Imagine being born into the shadow of a man whose exploits were already legendary, a man who had generals capable of overthrowing each other in the blink of an eye. Alexander IV was destined for greatness, or perhaps more accurately, for being used as a pawn in the endless game of Macedonian politics. His early years were spent in the care of regents, mostly well-meaning men with an eye on the throne, or at least an eye on the tax revenue. These regents did not, as one might hope, groom him gently for eventual rule. Instead, they wove a delicate web of alliances, betrayals, and obscure legal maneuvering, the kind of thing that makes modern politicians look like preschoolers arguing over blocks. And naturally, it all went terribly. By the time he was 12, Alexander IV was executed. Which is, a grim way to go, especially considering he hadn't yet had the chance to mismanage even a small fief. Let's drift over to another famous conqueror, Genghis Khan. He fathered, by conservative estimates, dozens of children, though naturally, the exact count is lost to history, partly because record-keeping in the Mongol steppes wasn't exactly meticulous, and partly because Genghis was prolific. One might imagine that with so many children, there would be a robust line of successors, each trained in the subtle art of world domination. In reality, Mongol succession was a slightly more chaotic affair. Genghis' children were expected to inherit vast territories, but also to fight each other, negotiate impossible alliances, and manage hordes of restless nomads. One particularly notable son, Ogidi Khan, was lucky enough to survive long enough to become Great Khan, but he was not exactly a visionary like his father. Ogidi drank quite a bit, and occasionally indulged in extravagant feasts while his empire simmered with small rebellions. History remembers him as competent, but not brilliant, basically, the grown-up version of someone who can follow a recipe but can't invent one. And the other children? Well, the rest of Genghis' sons fell into that familiar pattern of internal squabbling, assassination, and brief reigns that ended in disappointment or worse. It's a recurring theme: the conqueror achieves immortality, the children inherit a fragile legacy, and then gradually, history's memory softens their edges into footnotes, obscure titles, and tragic what-ifs. Perhaps the most quietly fascinating example comes from the relatively tranquil courts of Europe. Consider Charlemagne, a man who united much of Western Europe under his rule. He fathered a large number of children, estimates vary, but at least 18 are named in records, and his offspring were, in theory, destined to continue his impressive work. In practice, not so much. Charlemagne divided his empire among his surviving sons, which seems fair at first glance. But of course, he did not anticipate that these sons would spend most of their time fighting each other. Pepin the Hunchback, one of his elder sons, attempted a rebellion and was promptly sent to a monastery. Not exactly a glamorous fate. Louis the Pious, meanwhile, struggled with the pressures of kingship and was often manipulated by family members and ambitious courtiers. In essence, Charlemagne built a dream empire, and the children immediately turned it into an extended soap opera. There's something gentle and almost sleepy about these stories when you think of them as a series of minor catastrophes unfolding over decades. They are not epic battles or high drama. They are awkward dinners, misplaced letters, small betrayals, and pettiness magnified by a crown. For the children of conquerors, life is not about glory, it's about surviving expectations that were frankly impossible. Moving eastward again, the Mughal dynasty in India offers another exquisite study in fragile inheritance. Consider Shah Jahan, the emperor who built the Taj Mahal. His personal life could almost be described as unintentionally tragic. He had several children, the most famous being his sons Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb. Dara, the elder, was a sensitive intellectual, drawn to philosophy and poetry, whereas Aurangzeb, well, let's just say he was ambitious. Very ambitious. Too ambitious. The result was an almost textbook example of sibling rivalry with historical consequences. Aurangzeb imprisoned his father in the Red Fort during the last years of Shah Jahan's life and eventually executed Dara. Dara's death marked a turning point in Mughal history, where the empire shifted from art and philosophy to a more austere, militaristic approach. It's a poignant example of how the personal failings, or strengths, of one child can reshape entire civilizations. And then there's poor Prince Edward of England, son of Edward III. He was known as the Black Prince, though the origin of that nickname is uncertain. Edward was expected to inherit his father's throne and continue his military successes. But life, as usual, was more interested in making things inconvenient. The Black Prince predeceased his father, leaving a 9-year-old son, Richard II, as king. Richard's reign was marked by mismanagement, rebellion, and general ineptitude. The young king never truly matured into the model ruler everyone hoped for, perhaps because childhood in the shadow of a legendary father is, psychologically, like trying to grow flowers in concrete. If we turn our attention to the Americas, the story is equally somber. Take Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor at the time of the Spanish arrival. He had many children, some of whom survived the brutal upheavals brought by the conquest. But surviving conquest is not the same as thriving. The children inherited not a thriving empire but a shattered one, their roles reduced to negotiation, adaptation, or, in the worst cases, execution or exile. Their father had built, or at least maintained, a world rich in culture and ritual, and they received a fragment of it, heavy with expectation and disappointment. Notice the pattern. Across continents, centuries, and cultures, the story repeats: the conqueror achieves fame, fortune, and, often, immortality in history books. The children inherit titles, lands, and wealth, but almost never the genius, charisma, or luck. Sometimes they are bright, occasionally even capable, but more often they stumble through the corridors of history with the faint echoes of greatness following them, like a shadow they can never quite outrun. And yet, there is something quietly comforting in this repetition. It reminds us that history is less about perfection and more about humanity. Even the greatest figures, those whose names are carved in stone, relied on heirs who were human. Fragile, awkward, mischievous, and sometimes tragically short-lived. Their stories drift softly through time, and tonight, as we settle into the stillness, we can watch them drift past like leaves on a calm river, gentle reminders that even greatness has its humbling moments. Let's pause here for a moment and breathe. Imagine Alexander IV in his regency, the Mongol princes arguing quietly in a tent somewhere on the steppe, Charlemagne's sons plotting minor rebellions in dimly lit halls, and Shah Jahan's sons vying for supremacy while the Taj Mahal gleamed silently in Agra. All of them, small humans navigating immense expectations, reminding us that history is not only shaped by grand battles or treaties, but by fragile, ordinary lives played out in extraordinary circumstances. We'll drift over next to a few more royals, slightly less famous but no less fascinating, whose childhoods were marked by fragility, strangeness, and the gentle melancholy of high expectations. The most inbred monarchs and peculiar royal lives. Let's drift now into the curious world of inbred monarchs. Settling in, perhaps with a warm drink or a soft pillow, we'll explore a rather uncomfortable truth. European royalty loved family so much, that sometimes, they married it. Over and over. And of course, they made a scientific mess of it. Take Charles II of Spain, for instance, famously nicknamed El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. He was the unfortunate culmination of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. His parents were uncle and niece, and his ancestors, well, let's say, closely acquainted, in genealogical terms. The result? Charles was born with a fragile body, poor health, and a slightly perplexed facial structure that historians delicately describe as a classic Habsburg jaw. In other words, he looked like a man perpetually unsure of why the world existed. Charles could barely speak clearly, could not produce an heir, and spent much of his life under the watchful eyes of doctors, courtiers, and family members who oscillated between adoration and quiet despair. He was, in essence, a cautionary tale of genetics whispered across generations: don't marry your relatives, because nature will remind you. Yet, of course, the Habsburgs ignored this lesson repeatedly, partly out of tradition and partly because marrying within the family preserved power. Across the Alps and into the German principalities, inbreeding produced more subtly odd results. Take some of the lesser-known German dukes, whose genealogies resembled tightly wound knots. They were generally healthy enough to rule, but often exhibited peculiar behaviors, obsessive routines, or mild cognitive difficulties. Imagine a man expecting to negotiate treaties while quietly counting his silverware or inspecting his reflection multiple times a day. History describes this as eccentricity, but tonight, we can gently call it a quirky consequence of generations of cousin marriages. Let's drift over to France, where the Bourbon dynasty had its own tragic comedy. Louis XIV, the Sun King, is remembered as a brilliant ruler, extravagant, and ridiculously long-lived for his era. But his family life? Less so. Louis XIV had dozens of children, most of whom were legitimized at some point. The legitimate line continued, though often precariously. His great-grandson, Louis XVI, inherited an extremely delicate sense of royal responsibility, and less sense of survival. Louis XVI's marriage to Marie Antoinette is infamous, not only for political reasons but for the sheer absurdity of royal life in a gilded cage. Marie Antoinette, the young Austrian princess, was expected to produce heirs, host magnificent balls, and charm an entire nation simultaneously. She largely succeeded at two of these tasks, but her inability to navigate France's economic collapse made her a convenient scapegoat. Meanwhile, Louis XVI, gentle and indecisive, tried to reign with honesty and decency, which is, of course, the least effective combination when one is expected to command armies, courts, and public opinion simultaneously. In the smaller courts of Europe, similar patterns emerge. Consider the childhood of Queen Victoria's descendants. Victoria herself was the product of careful dynastic marriages, designed to consolidate power across Europe. Her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren continued this tradition, resulting in a web of relationships so tangled that by the early 20th century, many European royals were cousins of cousins of cousins. Some suffered from hemophilia, others from eccentricities that historians describe politely, often with phrases like delicate constitution or nervous temperament. The consequences of these unions are subtle, but perceptible: fragile bodies, fragile minds, and fragile politics. Royals were expected to embody perfection, yet their bodies often whispered otherwise. It is almost soothing, in a quiet way, to observe that even the most powerful humans are subject to the gentle tyranny of genetics, as inevitable as the tides. Moving from genes to habits, let's consider the peculiar routines of some royals. Take Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire. Rudolph was brilliant, imaginative, and completely unreliable. He spent long hours in darkened rooms, obsessed with alchemy, astrology, and the occasional exotic animal. His court, meanwhile, descended into chaos, because of course they did. Rudolph's ministers tried to govern while he wandered around, observing strange clouds in jars or consulting astrologers about the future of Europe. Or consider Frederick the Great of Prussia, a man so disciplined in public life that his private quirks are almost comforting. He enjoyed playing the flute, composing music, and philosophizing in his study. Yet he was also fastidious about the cleanliness of his quarters and insisted on elaborate daily routines. Guests would be gently bewildered by his insistence on protocol, while he quietly judged their failures in silence. It is a peaceful, if slightly ridiculous, vision, a man who conquered armies but worried deeply about the angle of his candlesticks. Strangeness often escalated when childhoods were indulgent. Louis XIV, again, as a young boy, was spoiled, protected, and surrounded by sycophants who encouraged every whim. As a result, he developed a taste for opulence that shaped Versailles and, arguably, contributed to France's later difficulties. Childhood indulgence, combined with dynastic pressure, created rulers who oscillated between brilliance and absurdity, capable of magnificent accomplishments but also minor catastrophes of taste or etiquette. It's worth noting, gently, that many of these monarchs suffered quietly. Their indulgences, odd routines, or mental fragilities were often born from immense pressure, to produce heirs, to secure borders, to maintain reputations. The public sees crowns and splendor, but history whispers of sleepless nights, nervous tics, and small, personal failures that humanize these figures. They were, in essence, children grown too fast, constrained by expectation, and left to navigate a labyrinth designed by generations of ancestors. Let's pause for a moment and picture some of these courts, softly lit by candlelight. Imagine Charles II shuffling slowly through a palace corridor, whispering instructions to courtiers who hesitate because they are unsure if he can actually pronounce them. Picture the young Louis XVI, awkwardly fumbling with courtly manners, his hands too large for gloves meant to symbolize elegance. Picture Queen Victoria, observing the genealogical mess she helped create, quietly noting which grandchildren might need special care. All of this unfolds in a kind of gentle, repetitive rhythm, a world where mistakes are minor disasters and eccentricities are daily companions. Even pets in royal courts contributed to this gentle chaos. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, had a fascination with her animals. Dogs, horses, and even monkeys roamed palace halls, requiring careful attention and occasionally causing minor diplomatic headaches. The presence of animals added softness to otherwise rigid lives, yet also highlighted the human fragility. Even monarchs needed companions who were uncomplicated, loyal, and non-judgmental. Returning to dynastic oddities, one cannot ignore the Portuguese court, where succession crises often led to brief reigns and minor scandals. Kings and queens were expected to marry for political alliance, sometimes resulting in unions between first cousins, occasionally more distant relatives. Over time, this produced a lineage of monarchs with minor ailments, eccentric preferences, and a remarkable capacity for dramatizing minor incidents. The sheer repetition of human error, cushioned by wealth and ceremony, creates a soothing cadence when one imagines it slowly, without urgency or alarm. We can also drift toward Russia, where the Romanovs present a slightly different flavor of royal oddity. Tsar Peter III, remembered largely for being overthrown by his wife, Catherine the Great, was gentle, weak-willed, and obsessed with foreign manners, much to the confusion of his subjects. Catherine, in contrast, combined ambition with intelligence and a certain ruthless pragmatism. Their marriage produced children, who then inherited a mix of charm, intellect, and occasionally disturbing instability, a formula for palace intrigue that historians recount with careful understatement. Perhaps the quietest, most human theme here is vulnerability. Dynastic pressure, fragile bloodlines, strange habits, and petty meltdowns create a series of lullabies in historical form. These stories are not terrifying, nor are they sensational in a dramatic sense. They unfold gently: a prince fails at diplomacy, a queen obsesses over her reflection, a child struggles with expectations too heavy for their age. History, in these moments, becomes a gentle, recurring wave, soothing in its predictability yet fascinating in its details. And as we drift toward the end of this section, let's imagine it all unfolding in slow motion. Candlelight flickers across the faces of young princes and princesses. Courtiers move quietly, uncertain which instruction to follow. The faint clatter of an exotic animal's cage provides a background rhythm. Somewhere in a palace, a future emperor quietly examines his hands, wondering why they cannot perform perfectly, while an older cousin attempts, politely, to correct minor missteps. These small, repeated gestures, fragile, human, slightly absurd, compose the quiet music of history we often overlook. Royal marriages gone wrong and fragile childhoods. Let's drift gently now into the world of royal marriages, where duty, politics, and personal preference rarely aligned, and the results were often, quietly disastrous. Imagine, if you will, a world where love was optional, paperwork was mandatory, and dynastic strategy outweighed happiness. Now, dim the lights a little more, settle deeper, and we'll move through the softly chaotic corridors of European palaces. Consider the marriage of Mary I of England and Philip II of Spain. Mary, known to history as Bloody Mary, for reasons we'll not dwell on tonight, was eager to secure her dynasty. Philip, by contrast, was less invested in her happiness and more invested in imperial politics. Their marriage, arranged from a distance, was famously awkward. Mary hoped for a romantic partnership, or at least a cooperative alliance. Philip sent gifts, distant letters, and occasional visits. And of course, the English public quietly despised him. Mary's hopes for a dynasty faded into a kind of quiet frustration, a royal melancholy softened only by her persistent desire for legitimacy. Moving eastward, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI offer a similar, if more tragic, study. Young Marie arrived in France at 15, expected to navigate a court that measured success in intricate etiquette, elaborate fashion, and absolute obedience. Louis XVI, shy, well-intentioned, and painfully awkward, was tasked with producing heirs, managing the nobility, and attempting to remain polite in all circumstances. Their marriage produced 4 children, yet their personal lives were full of quiet misunderstandings, small resentments, and the slow accumulation of public blame. The court whispered, the masses criticized, and the children, caught in the middle, became symbols of dynastic hope and fragile continuity. Let's drift north to Scandinavia. Queen Christina of Sweden, famous for abdicating her throne, presents an interesting twist. Christina's marriage never happened, not because of political mismanagement, but because she found the institution, in her words, less than compelling. She was expected to marry, produce heirs, and secure the succession. She chose instead to live a life of intellectual pursuit, surrounded by scholars, artists, and philosophical debates. The court, naturally, found this mildly inconvenient. Yet Christina's personal rebellion reminds us that royal marriages were not merely about romance, they were instruments of state, sometimes cruel, sometimes absurdly rigid, and occasionally defied entirely by the whims of strong personalities. In addition to unfortunate unions, the children born of royal marriages often inherited fragile health, excessive pressure, or both. Consider the young Louis XVII of France, son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Poor Louis XVII's childhood was marked by neglect, trauma, and imprisonment during the French Revolution. He never ruled, never saw comfort beyond brief, illusory periods, and died at the tender age of 10. His short life stands as a quietly tragic emblem of how dynastic expectation and historical upheaval collide, leaving children to navigate impossible circumstances. Across Europe, the theme of sickly or spoiled children repeats. Charles VI of France, known later as Charles the Mad, was physically unremarkable but emotionally fragile. His children were raised in a court rife with anxiety, ritual, and caution. Some developed minor illnesses, others were pampered to a fault, taught to anticipate every whim of a monarch who often could not manage his own moods. Charles VI himself, prone to sudden bouts of melancholy and delusion, added a layer of unpredictability to these young lives, demonstrating that royal fragility is sometimes inherited, sometimes environmental, and occasionally a mixture of both. Even the most famous or accomplished children could be rendered tragically ineffective. Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, the only son of Henry VI of England and Margaret of Anjou, was born into civil war. He grew up amidst instability, rebellion, and constant threat. Though educated and intelligent, he was ultimately powerless to prevent his father's deposition, his own capture, and eventual death at the Battle of Tewkesbury. His life, brief and turbulent, is a whisper in history, reminding us that dynastic birth does not always equal agency, and that circumstance often trumps talent. Royal upbringing, while filled with tutors, etiquette lessons, and luxurious surroundings, often bordered on the absurd. Children were expected to learn languages, diplomacy, swordplay, and poetry, often all at once, while remaining polite to a dozen aunts, uncles, and courtiers who monitored every expression. Mistakes were tolerated politely, unless they were embarrassing, in which case they were remembered forever. Imagine a young prince reciting a poem incorrectly, only to have it recorded in court chronicles as a minor character flaw. These small pressures, when compounded across years, produced adults who were either excessively meticulous, socially anxious, or quietly rebellious. Let's drift to Austria, where Emperor Joseph II attempted to reform not only his empire but also the manner in which royal children were raised. Joseph was obsessed with efficiency, rationality, and enlightened governance. He imposed strict educational routines on his children, combined with philosophical instruction that might have overwhelmed even the most curious young mind. Yet the children, like all children, resisted in subtle ways, slipping away for small pleasures, misbehaving quietly, or developing eccentric habits. The contrast between rational expectation and human unpredictability offers a gentle, ongoing meditation on the nature of upbringing under intense historical scrutiny. Royal indulgence often coexisted with fragility. Consider the young Mary, Queen of Scots, who became queen at 6 days old and lived her early years in the care of regents and tutors. She was beautiful, intelligent, and remarkably poised for a child of her age. Yet her upbringing was shaped by political maneuvering, kidnapping, and exile. Her life, while glamorous in some respects, was quietly precarious, a reminder that early exposure to power rarely produces freedom, only responsibility, and occasionally, trauma. Even minor courtiers and attendants contributed to these gentle disasters. Children in royal households were surrounded by adults eager to instruct, correct, or subtly manipulate. Tutors could be excessively strict, nurses overprotective, and siblings competitive. Imagine a 9-year-old prince navigating lessons in Latin, dance, and swordplay while simultaneously learning which words pleased the king and which led to whispered complaints. It is a soft, repetitive rhythm, a series of small challenges and minor humiliations, but for those of us observing centuries later, it unfolds with a strangely comforting predictability. Let's drift back to England for a moment. Queen Anne, daughter of James II, became queen in her own right after decades of political upheaval. Her childhood was a mixture of indulgence, religious tension, and delicate health. She survived smallpox, chickenpox, and numerous minor ailments, all while being carefully raised to navigate a complex religious and political landscape. Her later life, marked by personal loss and political stress, was perhaps inevitable given the early pressures she faced. Yet she managed, quietly, to exert influence over her kingdom, even as her body and family life faltered. And of course, childhood fragility sometimes resulted in eccentricity. Peter the Great of Russia, though immensely powerful as an adult, was reportedly a peculiar child, fascinated by carpentry, mechanical inventions, and the workings of foreign ships. His upbringing, while careful and formal in some respects, allowed space for curiosity and mischief. The contrast between these early fascinations and his later military and administrative genius is subtle but striking, a reminder that even the most disciplined rulers often start with a mixture of whimsy and chaos. Royal indulgence, fragile health, and poorly matched marriages combine to create a surprisingly coherent pattern, a slow, gentle drift toward history's quiet tragedies. Children, expected to embody dynastic glory, often faltered under pressure, developing eccentricities, minor illnesses, or simply failing to match the grandeur expected of them. Marriages designed to preserve power sometimes failed entirely on a human level, producing offspring who were either fragile, clever in mischief, or quietly tragic. Imagine, softly, a gallery of these lives: the Black Prince's careful lessons in knighthood, Marie Antoinette's young daughter learning etiquette under enormous scrutiny, a Russian czar-to-be tinkering with mechanical models while the world waits, and countless lesser-known princes and princesses drifting between tutors, pets, and courtiers. Their lives were patterned, repetitive, and occasionally absurd, but always human, fragile, and quietly moving. And as we drift toward the close of this section, let's reflect gently on the combination of heredity, circumstance, and expectation. Dynastic ambition is a slow tide, it shapes bodies, minds, and relationships. Children inherit not only crowns and titles but also pressure, eccentricities, and occasionally disease. Their lives unfold like a soft, persistent melody. Sometimes joyful, sometimes melancholic, but always patterned, gentle, and oddly comforting in its predictability. Petty meltdowns, bizarre habits, and whimsical royal disasters. Now, let's drift gently into the quieter, slightly absurd corners of royal adulthood. Settling further into your chair or pillow, we'll explore the moments when monarchs, supposed paragons of dignity and power, displayed small, human, and often ridiculous flaws. Not wars, not revolutions, just the tiny, ongoing disasters that occur when immense privilege meets the quirks of personality. Take, for instance, the infamous Charles VI of France, whose earlier childhood we touched upon. His adult life was punctuated by periodic bouts of mental instability, often called meltdowns in polite historical shorthand. He would wander palace corridors, sometimes dressed as a peasant, sometimes lost for days, sometimes convincing himself he was made of glass and instructing attendants not to touch him. Imagine the servants, softly navigating the fragile world of a king who alternated between states of delusion and occasional clarity. Life in the court, you see, was a slow, careful choreography, one wrong step, one misinterpreted phrase, and everything unraveled. Or consider the gentle eccentricities of Louis XIV. He ruled for decades with unmatched grandeur, yet he was meticulous to a fault. Candles had to be a certain height, his shoes polished in a particular order, and the court's daily routines orchestrated like a musical score. He could, at times, lose hours simply inspecting fabrics, tapestries, or decorative furniture. To us, it reads as obsessive, but in the palace it was simply another Tuesday. Small meltdowns were rare, but when they occurred, courtiers tiptoed with the kind of nervous energy usually reserved for cat owners tiptoeing around sleeping kittens. Russia offers us one of the more charmingly bizarre cases. Catherine the Great, despite her brilliance and political acumen, indulged in small eccentricities. She had pets, including dogs, birds, and even exotic animals, whose comfort sometimes took precedence over political affairs. It is comforting, in a way, to imagine an empress, sovereign of millions, quietly fussing over a pet while an empire waited for decisions. Petty meltdowns might have been limited to misplaced breakfast items or a sudden desire to rearrange furniture, yet these small, humanizing quirks remind us that even rulers are just people, prone to annoyance, obsession, or whimsy. And then there are monarchs whose eccentricities were more performative, almost theatrical in their absurdity. Peter III of Russia, briefly mentioned earlier, delighted in showing off his obsession with Prussian military precision, sometimes parading troops around the palace in a manner more suited to a meticulous child than a reigning emperor. His wife, Catherine, observed quietly, planning the eventual coup that would secure her ascendance. It is a gentle irony. The emperor, absorbed in minute perfection, oblivious to the larger currents of power, while the future empress waited, patient and calculating. Even mundane habits could be magnified into minor disasters by palace life. Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, for example, spent hours examining strange jars, consulting astrologers, and studying alchemy. His court descended into soft chaos, courtiers wandering aimlessly, unsure which of Rudolph's obsessions demanded attention that day. It is almost hypnotic to imagine it, a palace suffused with candlelight, jars containing cloud-like substances, whispered conversations about omens, all unfolding at a slow, lazy rhythm. The empire ran, somehow, despite, or perhaps because of, the gentle eccentricity at its center. Bizarre behaviors could also take quieter, more intimate forms. Some kings had unusual obsessions with personal hygiene. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, for instance, bathed frequently, unusually so for the era. Yet reportedly had complex rituals, involving attendants, oils, and precisely folded towels. To the modern mind, it reads as peculiar, but it is also a subtle reminder, royal life, in all its grandeur, was punctuated by strangely personal routines. Meltdowns often arose not from politics, but from disrupted rituals. A missing towel, a misplaced brush, a delay in breakfast, these could be enough to disrupt a carefully maintained equilibrium. And of course, the petty disputes among royals themselves could be quietly epic. Sibling rivalry, inheritance squabbles, and minor insults often escalated, not into battles or executions, though sometimes they did, but into long-lasting grudges and whispered resentment. Imagine the Habsburg family, quietly arguing over seating arrangements, titles, or floral arrangements at court events, while historians centuries later observe the absurdity with gentle amusement. Power, after all, magnifies every human flaw. Some monarchs displayed eccentricity in creative ways. Louis XIV, again, insisted on performing in court ballets, which he choreographed himself. He would practice endlessly, demanding perfection, occasionally dissolving into frustration if steps were imperfect. Courtiers would watch politely, knowing resistance was futile. It is a soothing image in its repetitiveness, a grown man, absolute monarch, practicing dances as if the stability of the world depended on his pirouettes. Even foreign courts offered similar moments of quiet absurdity. Emperor Akbar of India, for instance, maintained a court of incredible sophistication, yet he also insisted on elaborate rituals of etiquette. The smallest mistakes could trigger murmurs of disapproval. Courtiers learned, over time, to navigate these rituals with precision, yet Akbar himself sometimes performed small, inexplicable gestures of favoritism or whimsy that left everyone guessing. In this, the royal world mirrors any human community. Patterns, rules, and gentle chaos coexist, forming the rhythm of life. And then there are monarchs whose personal failures were quietly tragic. Charles II of Spain, previously discussed for inbreeding, also exhibited gentle meltdowns that were largely ceremonial. His frail body and fragile mind made minor incidents, spilled ink, mislaid papers, misplaced attendance, moments of deep personal frustration. Courtiers, accustomed to delicacy, navigated these disruptions with a soft, hypnotic patience. The repetition of minor crises becomes, viewed from centuries later, almost lulling in its predictability. Even romantic and domestic arrangements added to this gentle, ongoing comedy. Marie Antoinette's attempts to maintain privacy, personal routines, and family cohesion in the French court were often thwarted by etiquette, gossip, and political oversight. Small disagreements over meals, clothing, or children's schooling could swell into palace-wide anxieties. The daily rhythm of royal life was a soft, endless ballet of minor inconveniences, human follies, and the occasional triumph of personal whimsy over strict protocol. In some cases, bizarre habits were intertwined with power. Tsar Ivan IV of Russia, known as Ivan the Terrible, imposed strict routines on court life, yet also indulged in sudden, inexplicable flights of temper. Courtiers, aware of the thin line between favor and disaster, navigated the world quietly, with soft, careful gestures. It is easy to imagine candlelit halls, whispered instructions, and the faint, repetitive thrum of a court moving cautiously around a volatile figure, a pattern simultaneously alarming and oddly soothing in its regularity. Even playful eccentricities could subtly alter history. Frederick the Great of Prussia, mentioned previously, enjoyed music, philosophy, and long walks. Yet he also obsessed over cleanliness, punctuality, and specific seating arrangements. These seemingly minor preferences shaped court dynamics, influenced diplomatic encounters, and created a predictable rhythm, small, repeated behaviors that molded the daily life of a kingdom. History, in these moments, is a soft, persistent wave, less about dramatic change and more about the ongoing, gentle impact of personality and habit. And finally, there's the quiet charm of minor failures. Kings who could not pronounce their children's names correctly, queens who forgot ceremonial gestures, courtiers who misplaced ceremonial items. These incidents may seem trivial, but they echo across centuries as reminders that royal life, for all its splendor, is subtly fragile. Every crown rests atop human imperfection, every throne supports eccentricity, and every palace harbors whispered, recurring patterns of folly and whimsy. Let's drift toward the close of this section with a soft reflection. Picture palace corridors, gently illuminated by candles. Imagine courtiers tiptoeing, children learning etiquette, monarchs obsessing over small details, and occasional pets wandering unnoticed. The world, vast and grand, slows in these intimate spaces. Power, expectation, and human peculiarity blend into a rhythm that is neither alarming nor chaotic, but gently persistent. The minor meltdowns, odd habits, and whimsical disasters of royals become a kind of historical lullaby, a series of soft, recurring patterns that soothe rather than excite, amuse rather than alarm. The fates of forgotten royal children. So far, we've wandered through the inconvenient offspring of Alexander, the weary descendants of Genghis Khan, the perpetually unlucky heirs of Napoleon, and the scattered sons of Attila the Hun. But history, in its endless talent for anticlimax, still has more forgotten royal children to offer. Some survived. Some vanished. And many spent their lives quietly proving that power tends to dissolve faster than anyone expects. Let's drift a little further. One child we might quietly pause on is Cleopatra Selene II. She was the daughter of Cleopatra VII, yes, the Cleopatra everyone remembers, and Mark Antony. You'd think being the daughter of Egypt's last queen and Rome's most dramatic politician would give her a secure legacy. Instead, it gave her exile. Because after her parents' suicides, she was paraded through Rome by Augustus like a prize turkey. And then, rather than being executed, she was married off to a client king in North Africa. Her new home was Mauritania, which is not exactly the glamour of Alexandria. She had coins minted with her face on them, but history remembers her mainly as a faint afterthought to her mother's grand collapse. Her brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus, didn't even get that much. No one is entirely sure what happened to him. He likely died young. And thus, the great Ptolemaic dynasty, full of inbreeding, ambition, and questionable eyeliner, slipped into silence. We might also remember the sad case of the sons of Ivan the Terrible. Ivan, for those blissfully unfamiliar, was Russia's first Tsar. He enjoyed torturing animals as a child, creating a private police force of violent thugs as an adult, and, famously, bludgeoning his own son to death in a fit of rage. This left Russia with another son, Fifer I, who was gentle, quiet, and entirely unprepared for ruling a massive, volatile empire. Fifer spent much of his time praying in churches. He was nicknamed Fifer the Bell Ringer because he genuinely enjoyed ringing the bells himself. It was sweet. It was pious. And it was a dreadful qualification for ruling Russia. His reign left power in the hands of ambitious advisors, and when he died childless, Russia tumbled into a period literally called the Time of Troubles. Which, admittedly, does not sound restful. There are also the peculiar children of the Ottoman sultans. The Ottomans had a long-standing habit of strangling brothers to avoid succession disputes. Yes, strangling. With bowstrings. It was considered tidier than bloodshed. This meant many royal children grew up either pampered in luxury or half expecting to be quietly suffocated at any moment. One especially notable survivor was Mustafa I, who spent much of his youth confined in the palace. When he finally became sultan, he displayed a fondness for releasing the palace's pet animals into the courtyards, including peacocks and camels. Officials found this embarrassing. They quietly put him back in confinement. It was not the most glorious arc for a child of empire. And then there were the children of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, ruled much of medieval Europe and became a symbol of Christian kingship. But in private, he was remarkably reluctant to let his daughters marry. He preferred to keep them at court. This did not mean they lived in celibacy. They had lovers, affairs, and children. Charlemagne, apparently unfazed by the irony, cheerfully raised the illegitimate grandchildren himself. The result was a court filled with awkward family dynamics. Charlemagne's sons inherited the empire, but they quickly split it into fragments. And his daughters, though well-educated and respected, slipped into semi-obscurity. Which feels very on-brand for medieval dynasties: too much ambition in the sons, too little recognition for the daughters. Now, to close this wandering survey of royal children, let's drift toward a more general truth. When you look at the offspring of conquerors, kings, and emperors, a pattern emerges. The parents built empires through blood, war, and spectacle. And the children, more often than not, inherited the consequences rather than the glory. They were paraded, exiled, quietly smothered, or kept in gilded cages. A few managed to carve out lives of their own, but most became shadows, faded names on the margins of history. It is, in its own strange way, almost comforting. History, which often feels like a parade of overwhelming personalities, is balanced by the realization that even the children of legends usually ended up like everyone else, tired, confused, and a little forgotten. So as you lie here, listening in the quiet, perhaps it's a gentle reminder that legacy is rarely what we imagine. The children of conquerors prove that empires collapse, dynasties fracture, and the names of the mighty blur into the background. And yet, life still continued, sometimes in a palace, sometimes in exile, sometimes in a monastery. And with that, let's let the story dissolve into stillness. Close your eyes. Let the noise of history fade into silence. And drift, like all those forgotten heirs, quietly into sleep.